To help you understand this question of does an external world exist a bit more, we have to talk about naive realism. What naive realism is it's sort of like the default metaphysical paradigm of most people, and the default one that underlies science and really modern society, like modern democracies. What naive realism basically says is that a physical permanent world exists beyond your current perception. So, for example, right, imagine the place that you grew up. Imagine the house that you grew up in, or one of them, or several of them. Now, what naive realism says is that that image is not just of a house that you're imagining. That house actually exists in the physical world, and it is permanently there whether you know it or not, right? So you can sort of imagine naive realism as you've got your eyes open right now, you can see around you, you can see to the edge of like the room that you're in, or the scene that you're looking at if you're outside, and maybe beyond that you can't actually see what is beyond that. What naive realism says is that the world that you think is beyond there is definitely real, and it's physical, and it's permanent, and it exists. Okay? So what I'm also kind of doing in this episode is questioning naive realism, because if I say, does an external world exist? I'm sort of asking, is naive realism true? So a lot of the things I'm going to be talking about here are related to naive realism and to the topic of the external world at the same time. So what my main conclusion is that naive realism is basically just an assumption. So it is an assumption to say that a physical permanent world exists beyond your current perception. It's an extraordinarily useful assumption that is true, yes, and it's one that we all use all of the time without even noticing it, yes, but it is still an assumption, right? Why is it an assumption? Because you cannot actually prove naive realism. It is an incomplete model, and it is self-sealed. That is, to prove it, you already have to believe in it. To show that it's true, you already have to be inside it. That's what I mean when I say it's self-sealed. And this brings into play something called the incompleteness theorem. I can't remember who. Some of you philosophy people will be screaming at me saying you can't remember who. I think it was Gödel, but that may be wrong. Gödel's incompleteness theorem says that basically all paradigms are self-sealing. Now that's my way of paraphrasing the conclusion, but it basically means to prove a paradigm is true, you have to basically assume that the paradigm is correct anyway. So what I'm saying here, and this is sort of the whole argument of the episode, is that naive realism is an assumption. Now, notice I'm not saying naive realism isn't true necessarily, because I think you can't prove it's true, and you cannot say that it's false either. How can you prove that it's false if you can't prove that it's true? It's an assumption, right? Now that is the main thing that I'm getting at here. It's an assumption, and it is an interpretation of our human experience. But that an assumption is not the same thing as reality. And that's a nice segue. We must, when we're talking about this question of does an external world exist, we have to distinguish reality from assumption. What is an assumption? An assumption is a plausible idea we hold to be true in order to serve an end. So it has a use. It's an idea that has a certain use, which may or may not be true in reality. An assumption is it's a supposition you make that is useful, but you don't actually know whether it's true or not. And that's what I'm saying naive realism is. That's what I'm saying, that the idea that there's a physical permanent world that exists beyond your perception of it is an assumption. It is useful, but it's not. The fact it's an assumption means that it's whether or not it's true is not actually relevant. It can still be an assumption without it actually being true. It might just be a useful one. In our case, the assumption looks like an external world exists because it seems like a viable explanation for how we experience life, even though we cannot perceive it. On the other hand, reality, so we're talking about assumption versus reality. Reality is just the nature of things. In particular, what I'm talking about is the actual nature of moment-to-moment human experience beyond concepts, right? So, this question of the external world, the assumption that naive realism makes is that it exists and it's permanent, it's there, whether or not you believe it and whether or not you can perceive it.